In 1279 BC, Ramesses II, who lends his name to this very account, took power as pharaoh of Egypt. Today, his name is renowned, but at the time of his ascension, most of the world's population had no awareness of his existence, or even of the land he governed. Similarly, Ramesses and his fellow Egyptians had only a limited understanding of the broader world beyond their borders. Though their knowledge surpassed that of Egyptians who had lived only a few centuries earlier, some members of Ramesses's court were aware of various foreign peoples discussed in this work. They had either encountered travelers from regions stretching from Nubia in the south to the Black Sea in northern Anatolia, and from the Greek mainland to western Iran, had themselves journeyed to those places. Beyond these boundaries, their awareness diminished significantly. While they may have seen artifacts from sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, or even Atlantic Europe, they likely had no idea who had made them. To modern historians, the world of 1279 BC remains largely a mystery, one that is difficult, if not impossible, to fully uncover. This is primarily because much of the global population left behind few, if any, tangible records. Vast numbers of people still did not practice agriculture or live in settled communities. Among those who did, only a minority formed urban societies, and fewer still developed written language. The traces of their lives are rare and often difficult to interpret. Prehistoric archaeologists have managed to reconstruct, to varying extents, aspects of life during the 13th century BC. However, we often lack even the most basic informations, such as what these people called themselves, or the languages they spoke. At best, our understanding is limited to the material remnants of their daily existence. And in many cases, there are no remains at all, especially when people were constantly on the move, leaving no lasting evidence. The more materially advanced and complex a society was, the greater the chance that something of it still survives. Today, by the latter part of the second millennium BC, only 3 regions around the world had reached a level of societal development marked by urban centers, intricate social structures, and economic systems that had moved far beyond mere subsistence. These cultures were scattered far apart, and it's almost certain that each evolved independently. Our knowledge of these societies varies greatly. In Central America, the Olmec civilization was just beginning to take shape. Their peak would not come until after 1200 BC, slightly beyond the time frame of this study. Living along the southern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, the Olmecs practiced agriculture and resided in early urban settlements. They had not yet developed a writing system, though. By around 1250 BC, they had begun building monumental structures which later became major religious centers. Despite some modern speculation, the Olmecs had no connections with cultures across the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans. Their achievements arose in isolation. The 2 other highly developed cultures of the 13th century BC were situated at the far ends of Asia, along the outer reaches of a vast zone that lay between Central Asia's arid steppes and deserts and the waters of the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Peninsula. These civilizations were small outposts on the expansive Eurasian continent, surrounded by largely rural or nomadic populations. Any interaction between them would have been indirect at best, and it is unlikely that either society was aware of the other's existence. From a historical standpoint, these 2 civilizations offer very different levels of accessibility. In East Asia, the Shang dynasty of China, located in the middle Yellow River Valley, began using a written script around 1200 BC. The writing that survives, mainly found on oracle bones and bronze vessels, offers limited insight, primarily consisting of royal names and brief records of specific events. The archaeological evidence from Shang China and nearby cultures is striking: fortified towns and villages, lavish tombs, and grand structures. Despite this, the region's early history is mostly reconstructed from later Chinese texts, and the inscriptions from the late 2nd millennium BC serve mainly to validate the names of kings recorded in those later narratives, in contrast to the East Asian situation. The western part of Asia, particularly the eastern Mediterranean coast, offered a very different picture. Along this stretch of land, multiple civilizations thrived side by side. leaving behind an abundance of written records, artifacts, and visual art that allow historians to study them in considerable depth. This was the world that Ramesses II and his court were familiar with. It included several powerful states considered equals to Egypt, and which we too know well today. Hatti, the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia and northern Syria. Babylonia in the south of present-day Iraq, and Assyria in the north of Iraq and eastern Syria. Beyond these lay the Mycenaean world of mainland Greece and the Aegean Islands. Along with the Elamite state in what is now southwestern Iran, smaller polities also dotted the west coast of Anatolia, the Syro-Palestinian corridor, and the island of Cyprus. Previously, northern Syria had been unified under the kingdom of Mitanni. The people of these regions lived in cities, adorned with monumental structures, and led lives filled with economic and cultural activity. They left behind a wealth of evidence about their world writings, tools, architecture that gives us detailed insight into their identities, languages, occupations, religious beliefs, and many other aspects of their lives. For its time, this level of documentation is extraordinary. If we imagine the globe of that era as mostly dark, with light shining only where historical sources survive, the Eastern Mediterranean is the one region clearly illuminated. Not surprisingly, global histories built on empirical data often center on this area, commonly calling it the Cradle of Civilization. This book focuses on that very region, the Eastern Mediterranean world. It is important to recognize how unusual it was for its time, a bright spot surrounded by vast areas of which we know very little. However, this surrounding world was not isolated. What occurred there could influence, and often did influence, the better documented cultures around the Mediterranean. Our knowledge of these outer regions is mostly indirect, drawn from later parallels or the fleeting moments when people from these areas entered the Mediterranean zone or traded goods with it. While it is easy to get lost in the richness of the sources we do have, we must not forget how much remains hidden. We often speak of studying the world, when in truth we are observing only a tiny, visible corner of it. The Eastern Mediterranean cultures can be examined from many angles, as evidenced by the vast number of scholarly books and articles dedicated to them. The surviving sources allow for the reconstruction of political, economic, social, diplomatic, religious, and cultural histories both for individual cultures and across them collectively. One of the defining traits of this region during this era is its internationalism. These states, better referred to as polities, since the modern term nation does not apply, were well aware of one another's presence and maintained extensive diplomatic and commercial relations. Many of them saw themselves as members of a shared system, with established hierarchies among participants. The depth and breadth of their interactions are unmatched in the ancient world. This has drawn much scholarly attention. Historically, this research has centered primarily on political dynamics. For instance, considerable work has been done on Egypt's influence over Syro-Palestinian territories and how internal events in Egypt shaped those relationships. Similarly, historians have closely studied the rivalry between Babylonia and Assyria, particularly in terms of power struggles and the decisions of individual rulers. However, my focus will take a different direction. Here, kings and queens, merchants and soldiers, farmers and artisans will be viewed not only through their personal actions, but as parts of a broader system, one whose complexity and interdependence likely exceeded their own awareness. Natural settings, economies, and social structures within each state, and across the region as a whole, form the underlying foundation of this system. In many ways, the specific conditions of each state were simply local variations of a shared framework, where every participant contributed consciously or not to the survival of the entire, interconnected world. History must be approached at multiple levels of abstraction. In this work, I will not concentrate on individual characteristics, but instead aim to explore the common features shared across these cultures. Features that made this era so distinctive in the context of ancient history. Specific historical events, such as battles, treaties, or political shifts, are not the central focus here. since no single event fundamentally changed the broader system. Rather, each event serves as a reflection of how the system operated and how it responded to both internal dynamics and external pressures. While these events will be mentioned, they function mainly as reference points that guide us toward a deeper understanding of the structures behind them. The type of history I aim to write aligns with what French historian Fernand Braudel described as social history. My approach is inspired by his renowned work on Mediterranean history during the reign of Philip II of Spain. A title I have consciously echoed in naming this book, but is it still valid today, especially in our postmodern intellectual climate too? Attempt to identify a systemic framework that underlies the histories of many cultures across a vast geographical region. Does this risk reviving a style of scholarship that has been criticized for decades for imposing generalized patterns on diverse peoples, disregarding their unique circumstances? And by adopting a title that echoes a study of the 16th century, AD, am I unintentionally implying that historical time in the Eastern Mediterranean remained static? Could this be seen as reinforcing the outdated Orientalist view of a timeless, unchanging Middle East? These are just some of the challenges and critical concerns a study of this kind must navigate. There are many valid ways to study a region's history, each with its own merits and purposes. The choice between emphasizing the particular versus the shared depends largely on the historian's goals and the available evidence. Microhistorical approaches, which zoom in on individuals or small communities, can be incredibly valuable. However, historians dealing with pre-modern periods rarely have enough information to reconstruct the inner lives or detailed thoughts of individuals. Even in the case of a 16th-century miller from Friuli, whose ideas were recorded by the Inquisition, it was the unusual nature of his beliefs and the obsessive record-keeping of the authorities that allowed his story to survive. In ancient history, focusing on the individual often leads to biographies of kings. The life of Ramesses II, for example, has been the subject of many detailed studies. A few of his contemporaries have also received similar treatment where the historical record permits. Yet such focus inevitably leaves out the wider population. Archaeologists rightly argue that we can learn much about these people through the physical remnants of their daily lives. In certain regions, we also possess texts that shed light on everyday activities. Tombs from Egypt's New Kingdom, for instance, reveal a wealth of information, with their occupants ranging from royals to individuals who appear to belong to a middle-class segment of society. Personal archives found in various cities of the Eastern Mediterranean offer insights into the business dealings of private citizens. These individuals and their experiences certainly deserve attention and study. Ancient world, opportunities to work at this level of detail are extremely rare. More often than not, we are left with fragmentary texts and artifacts that provide little context when examined in isolation. As a result, we are frequently compelled to shift our focus away from individual stories and instead seek broader patterns by examining cultures collectively. This has led to the dominance of what might be called national histories and, admittedly, anachronistic terms such as studies of Egypt during the New Kingdom, the Hittite Empire, or Kassitera, Babylonia. These accounts blend information about both rulers and ordinary people to present a broader view of each state's historical trajectory. This approach is not only valid, but often necessary. Given the nature of the sources and the limitations of the historical record, a historian can choose to step even further back, disregarding the boundaries of individual states. At this broader level of abstraction, specific events fade from focus, and greater generalizations are made. Admittedly, this approach risks overlooking the unique circumstances of individuals, yet it also allows for a deeper level of comprehension, because interpreting isolated events or people without placing them within a wider context is nearly impossible. Can we truly understand a state like New Kingdom Egypt without relying on broader, conceptual frameworks about how ancient states functioned? How do we explain what we observe without immediately referring to general ideas shaped by long-standing assumptions? Of course, these frameworks often lean heavily on what previous scholars have believed, and are sometimes entangled with outdated racial, gendered, or cultural biases. That is why they must be continuously reassessed and revised. While such a macro-level perspective inevitably smooths over the rich diversity of individual lives. The belief that one can make sense of a single historical moment without any larger reference system is simply not sustainable. And what about the cliché of the Middle East as an unchanging region? By referencing Braudle's study of the 16th century Mediterranean, aim to highlight shared methods and perspectives not to equate historical realities across time. Still, some elements of a region's history do endure longer than others. Braudle introduced the idea of different layers of historical time, one of which operates on a geological scale rather than a purely human one. Humanity's relationship with the environment, the foundation of survival, changed little throughout the pre-industrial era. Even though we must account for shifts in climate over time, long-lasting patterns in farming, sailing, and trade often persisted across centuries, even millennia. Some of the behaviors Braudle documented in the 16th century AD were already evident in the 13th century BC. That said, much had changed at the level of individual experience. The political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean during the reign of Ramesses II was entirely different from that of Philip II's era. Religion, culture, and the economy had also evolved significantly. I am not arguing for deep historical continuity between these two periods, but rather suggesting that they can be examined using comparable, analytical approaches. This brings us to a fundamental question. Where do we draw the boundaries? Where should the study begin and end, and which region should be included or left out? Historians are ultimately dependent on their sources that are distributed unevenly across both geography and time. From the start, though, it is clear that the Eastern Mediterranean was dominated by literate societies. The written records indicate participation in a larger international network, which is the central concern of this study. The very act of writing reflects certain societal traits, hierarchical structures, advanced economies, and social systems that encouraged documentation and enabled some members of society to communicate in written form. Every culture discussed here experienced periods where writing was minimal or absent. Within each society, literacy was limited to a minority. Moreover, they all had contact with neighboring communities that did not use writing at all. Nevertheless, the presence of writing is a defining feature of all the civilizations covered in this work. It provides the boundaries for our investigation, even though non-written materials remain an essential source of historical knowledge as well. Defining historical boundaries based on a single characteristic, such as the presence of writing, is inherently imprecise. The discovery of a single cache of documents, for example, could shift our understanding and require us to include an additional century or a new geographic area. In the kind of historical study pursued here, such uncertainties are less troublesome than they would be in a strictly political history. This is because our focus lies on long-term developments, which rarely begin or end abruptly. This work will concentrate on the latter half of the 2nd millennium BC, though the exact time frame will remain flexible depending on the region under discussion. The beginning of this period is particularly difficult to pin down, as different cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean emerged into the historical record at various points between the 16th and 14th centuries BC in Babylonia. For instance, it was during the 14th century that kings began commissioning, building inscriptions texts that confirm their reigns and offer more concrete historical evidence than later king lists. The dynasty's political stability led to economic growth, which created the need for a more elaborate bureaucracy. This in turn left us with more detailed documentation by the mid-14th century. In Egypt. Writing never vanished entirely during the so-called Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1640 to 1539 BC, but it was mostly limited to brief inscriptions. It's far less abundant than the written records from the 15th through 13th centuries. Meanwhile, in mainland Greece, written documents appear only toward the end of the period and are sparse in both quantity and content. In that case, archaeology is our primary source of information, which tells us that the culture in question likely began forming around 1600 BC. The end of the period is often linked to the widespread upheaval that occurred around 1200 BCA, turning point that severely impacted societies in the Aegean and the Levant. This catastrophic wave led to the destruction of many palaces and cities across Greece, Crete, Anatolia, and the coastal regions of Syrio-Palestine, abruptly ending much of what had existed. However, not all Eastern Mediterranean cultures experienced the same fate. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, while a decline set in, there was no sudden collapse. The ruling dynasties endured for about another century. Although historians of these regions do not typically mark 1200 as a strict dividing line, the signs of decline were already apparent by then, and what followed were the waning days of an era. Even in areas of Syro-Palestine, where some states survived the crisis, they gradually weakened and eventually gave way to new formations. By 1100 BC, most of the Eastern Mediterranean, apart from Egypt, had ceased using writing. If literacy did persist in some places, the evidence of it has yet to be found. To define the geographical focus of this study, it is useful to begin at the core and move outward. Once again, the presence of writing serves as our guide. The heart of this world was a crescent-shaped region extending from southern Babylonia to southern Egypt. It includes Babylonia, Assyria, northern Syria, central Anatolia, the Syro-Palestinian coast, and the Nile Valley up to Upper Nubia. In all these regions, writing was widespread. Surrounding this core were areas such as western Iran and the Aegean, where writing existed but was more limited in scope and use. All of the regions within the Eastern Mediterranean sphere maintained contacts beyond their immediate borders. The Babylonians engaged with communities around the Persian Gulf. The Assyrians interacted with eastern Anatolia and parts of northwest Iran. The Hittites had connections to the north and west. The Mycenaeans reached as far as Italy and islands in the western Mediterranean, and the Egyptians dealt with Libya and territories south and east of Nubia. The exact extent of these connections remains uncertain. Some scholars have proposed that a broader world system existed at the time, linking cultures across Eurasia with the Eastern Mediterranean as its center. However, this view likely overstates the case. Direct contact beyond formidable natural barriers, such as the Alps, the Caucasus, the Hindu Kush, the Sahara, and the Arabian deserts, was probably rare at best. It is also important not to assume that everyone in these core regions was literate or lived in settled communities. In every society, large segments of the population existed on the margins of the historical record. We know of them primarily through the writings of their literate neighbors or through sparse archaeological findings. It's partly due to their limited material resources compared to urban dwellers, but also reflects the tendency of modern archaeology to overlook them. Yet, these non-literate and mobile groups played significant roles during this entire period, and they may have been key players in the collapse of the established order. To understand their impact, we must make an effort to examine the scant and often biased sources that provide glimpses into their lives. In determining which periods and regions to include in this study, I have chosen to use the presence of written records as a primary criterion. But is this approach truly justified? After all, writing in antiquity was a skill limited to a small segment of the population, and much of what was written during the second millennium BC has either been lost over time or remains undiscovered. Moreover, writing represents only one aspect of a culture. Perhaps other indicators, such as the level of urban development, which can be measured archaeologically and is less affected by the randomness of what survives, might offer a better foundation for defining the scope of this investigation. Even so, I believe the emphasis on writing is warranted for two key reasons. First, this is a historical study, and written records are the foundation of historical research. While archaeological and geographical evidence are invaluable, it is the written texts produced by these societies that provide the most direct insights into their historical context. Second, although writing first appeared in parts of the Eastern Mediterranean as early as the late 4th to early 3rd millennium BC, its use over time was far from consistent. In the most literate and well-documented regions, Mesopotamia, in Egypt, the knowledge of writing was never entirely lost after its invention. This continuous tradition is evident in the development and persistence of scripts and writing techniques. Furthermore, the quantity and nature of written material allows us to distinguish different periods within these civilizations' histories. There is a clear link between the volume of surviving texts and the political strength of the states that produce them. Periods marked by centralized, powerful governments saw a significant increase in writing activity. Royal inscriptions became more frequent and more detailed. Expanding state bureaucracies generated large amounts of administrative documentation. Similarly, periods of economic growth led to a rise in private record-keeping. As individuals documented commercial transactions and legal matters, this pattern holds true across much of pre-modern history. Times of political fragmentation and reduced writing are often referred to as Dark Ages. The metaphor of writing as the light that guides historical inquiry is deeply rooted in how we understand the past. In the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, fluctuations in the volume of written material closely followed changes in centralized authority. The widespread use of writing between the 14th and 12th centuries BC strongly suggests that this was a period dominated by stable states and vigorous economies. For that reason, the presence of writing serves not only as a practical boundary for this study, but also as a meaningful indicator for defining the core areas and timeframes under examination. Throughout this period, history is filled with countless individuals, men and women whose actions have come down to us through recorded accounts. Yet aside from a few well-known exceptions, most of these historical figures remain unfamiliar to those outside the realm of scholarly study. A handful of personalities stand out with exceptional fame, especially within the ancient world. Ramesses II, for example, is renowned largely due to his monumental constructions, and has been featured in numerous films, exhibitions, and both. Popular in academic work since the early days of deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs, Queen Hatshepsut attracts attention for having ruled a major empire as a woman, Akhenaten for his radical religious changes, and Tutankhamun for the extraordinary wealth discovered in his tomb. The only royal burial from this period found intact when it was unearthed in 1922. Unsurprisingly, all of these individuals hail from Egypt, civilization that continues to astonish with its architectural and cultural legacy. In contrast, the contemporaries of Egyptian pharaohs, rulers from neighboring states, are far less recognized, and even the names of the lands they governed remain obscure to many. To help clarify this context, I will present a broad overview of political and military events shaped by individuals, since such actions often influence how we perceive historical periods. Asterisk. Although extensive studies exist on the histories of specific states and their interactions, the account here will offer only a condensed summary, focusing more on the region as a whole rather than detailing each state individually. That said, I will highlight the case of the Kingdom of Mitanni to illustrate how the fate of a single state could be influenced by developments throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Historians aim to provide exact dates whenever possible. Modern history, we can often pinpoint the precise hour a critical decision was made. But the further we reach into the past, the less precise these timelines become. Hours become days, then months, and eventually we are left with approximate years. In ancient history, this imprecision is common, hence the frequent use of the term circa, as in Plato was born around 428 BC. While such vagueness may be frustrating, working within a consistent sequence still allows us to establish a relative chronology. For instance, Plato came after Socrates and before Aristotle. In this book, however, we are dealing with multiple historical timelines, each with its own sequence and level of precision. For civilizations like Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia, we have a fairly reliable order of rulers and knowledge of the lengths of their reigns, as these cultures base their dating systems on regnal years. In contrast, for places like Hatti, Mitanni, and Elam, our grasp of chronology is weaker. We know the names of many rulers, but how long they ruled is often unclear. In the Aegean world, we don't even have confirmed names of monarchs, relying instead almost entirely on archaeological evidence to piece together a rough timeline. Chronology becomes even more complicated when we try to synchronize the histories of different regions. Attempting to weave these various timelines into one unified framework for the Eastern Mediterranean highlights the flaws in each system. For instance, some historians might date the reign of the Assyrian king Ossurubalit from 1365 to 1330 BC and place the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. Between 1353 and 1336 BC, others might assign different dates entirely 1353 to 1318. For Ossurubalit, in 1367 to 1354, Akhenaten, these differences drastically change our interpretation of events. If Ossurubalit corresponded with Akhenaten, as we know he did, was he writing as a seasoned ruler, addressing a relatively new king, or was it the other way around? The absolute dating systems used today are built on complex interpretations of various sources such as astronomical data in Egypt or royal lists in Assyria. The challenges grow even greater when dealing with Elam Mitanni, or Hatti. Synchronisms help, such as knowing that Ramesses II fought the Hittite king Muwatalli II in his 5th year, but even then, you can't be sure when that moment occurred. In the Hittite king's reign, chronology, in this context, feels like a fragile structure carefully constructed, yet always vulnerable to being reshaped by new findings, despite the massive scholarship behind it. Still, it remains a vital framework that allows us to talk meaningfully about the region's history. It is a tool we aim to make as accurate as possible, while acknowledging that it may be subject to change. The chronological system used in this study will hopefully remain consistent throughout. However, it is not meant to appear absolute. It is a practical structure, one open to correction, refinement, and reinterpretation. Even within this somewhat fragile chronological framework, it is still possible to construct a political history of the Eastern Mediterranean that centers on the actions of key individuals, primarily kings and military leaders. My aim is to bring some structure to the vast array of information available, revealing how this region experienced a clear trajectory of growth, flourishing, and eventual decline. Modern historians often view the concept of historical cycles with skepticism, criticizing it as overly simplistic and likening it perhaps unfairly to the stages of a human life. History, after all, doesn't repeat itself in neat loops. Still, certain historical conditions do emerge, persist for a time, and then fade away. The rise and fall of empires, for instance, doesn't mean a return to the past, but rather marks the end of a particular phase in a region's development. In much the same way, during the Late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean gave rise to a system that endured for several centuries before disappearing. This era was flanked by 2 dark ages, periods during which the archaeological and written records are so sparse that even determining the passage of time becomes difficult. Yet, between these obscure intervals, there was a time of extraordinary activity and achievement. It was an era in which the entire region evolved into a highly interconnected and complex network of societies. Around the mid-16th century BC, a student from Thebes, Egypt, transcribed an inscription originally commissioned by King Kamose, who ruled approximately 1545 to 1539 BC. In the text, King voices his frustration over the fractured political state of Egypt at the time. Why should I even acknowledge my own strength? One ruler holds avarice, another governs Kush, and here I sit, surrounded by an Asiatic and a Nubian. Each man controls a portion of Egypt. The land is carved up around me. Kamose's anger reflects the reality that Egypt, once united from the Mediterranean coast to the Second Cataract of the Nile, was now fragmented. From his base in Thebes, Kamose had no control over the Delta region or some stretches of the Nile Valley to the south, nor over the territory beyond the First Cataract. Just 150 years earlier, the ruler of Thebes had governed all of Egypt and maintained military outposts deep into Nubia. Egypt's territorial unity had been exceptional during the early part of the second millennium BC, but Egypt was not alone. In earlier centuries, large and powerful states had also existed elsewhere in the eastern Mediterranean. In the mid-18th century BC, Hammurabi ruled over united southern Mesopotamia. The king of Aleppo controlled northern Syria, and the ruler of Elam presided over a sizable domain. By the 17th century, Hittite kings had consolidated central Anatolia under their authority. By the early 16th century, however, these empires had disappeared. Internal conflicts played a role, But the problems ran deeper. The region was left with only a handful of small power centers with limited reach, and much of the surrounding territory was held by non-urban populations. Major cities had declined or been abandoned, becoming isolated pockets surrounded by rural zones where settlements were often temporary. Economic activity and trade had slowed dramatically. As a result, very little historical record survives. From this period, the mid-2nd millennium BC remains a time of historical obscurity. Only in Egypt and Babylonia did writing continue. Even there, it was sparse. Still, from this shadowy and fragmented world, a new system eventually emerged. Out of the turmoil of the mid-2nd millennium's dark age, two major states emerged. On opposite sides of the Syro-Palestinian region, the newly formed kingdom of Mitanni in northern Syria, and a reunified Egypt entering what we now call the New Kingdom era. These two powers were initially separated by the Syro-Palestinian lands, but their expansionist ambitions eventually brought them into direct confrontation. Mitanni remains one of the enigmas of ancient history, though it held significant power. During the latter part of the 2nd millennium BC, it is scarcely known today. One major obstacle to reconstructing its history is the lack of knowledge regarding its capital. We know the city's name Washukani and that it was located somewhere in northeastern Syria or southeastern Turkey, near the headwaters of the Haber River. However, its exact location remains unknown. As a result, we lack archives from the kingdom's core, and there are no surviving royal inscriptions or king lists. Most of what we know comes from external references and records from border cities. Nevertheless, the presence of Mitanni's royal seal on clay tablets found across a wide area of northern Syria and Iraq suggests the state's reach was substantial. This influence is also confirmed by autobiographical inscriptions left by rulers who served under Mitanni authority. Around 1500 BC, Idrimi, ruler of the city of Alala, located in modern-day Turkey roughly 50 kilometers west of Aleppo, commissioned a statue of himself inscribed with the story of how he rose to power. The tale reads like a heroic legend. The younger son of an exiled royal family rises to become king. Though we shouldn't take every detail at face value, it highlights the authority held by the Mitanni king. Igni's family originally hailed from Aleppo, but had fled to Imar along the Euphrates for unknown reasons. Restless, Igni left Imar and joined a band of exiles who eventually seized control of Alalek and nearby towns. This turn of events brought him into contact with Patatarna, king of Mitanni. For 7 years, Patatarna, the mighty king and leader of the Hurrian warriors, opposed me. In the 7th year, I sent a letter to him, reminding him of the peaceful relations my ancestors had with the Hurrians. Our message pleased the Hurrian rulers, and they agreed to a binding pact. The strong king acknowledged the loyalty of my predecessors and the oath they had taken. He accepted my greeting, I restored his lost holdings, and I pledged loyalty to him. With this, I was made king in Alalak. Following Idrimi's appointment, nearby rulers attacked, but he successfully repelled them and ruled for 3 decades. Asterisk in his account. Idrimi referred to Patatarna as the leader of the Hurrian forces. The Hurrians are a people we primarily recognize today through their language. By the mid-2nd millennium BC, Hurrian had been spoken across northern Syria for centuries. Though it never became a dominant language in written records, even at the Mitanni court, Babylonian not Hurrian, was typically used in official texts, reflecting the broader linguistic norms of the Near East. Despite this, the Hurrians had, during the Dark Age, managed to establish political dominance over northern Syria and exert control over the region's diverse populations. Their kingdom became known internationally as Mitanni, with its political center located somewhere near its mysterious capital, Washukani. Asterisk Mitanni's territory and influence shifted over time, but in the early 15th century BC, it was particularly far-reaching. During Idrimi's reign, the Mitanni king held sway over lands stretching from the southern coast of Anatolia, west of Alalek, across northern Syria and Iraq, and as far east as the Tigris River and the Middle Euphrates. This vast area included numerous client kingdoms, all subject to the authority of Mitanni's ruler. Up until around 1350 BCE, Mitanni's dominance remained largely unchallenged. Apart from a few Egyptian military expeditions deep into northern Syria during the 15th century, some Egyptian pharaohs advanced as far as Carchemish, the key crossing point over the Euphrates River, but none of these campaigns posed a real threat to Mitanni's existence. Although Egypt and Mitanni vied for influence over the Syrian city-states located west of the Euphrates, there is no evidence of direct military conflict between the two. In fact, during the reign of Amenhotep II, 1426 to 1400 BCE, the two powers became allies, solidifying their relationship through marriage when a Mitanni princess, sister of King Tushratta, was sent to Egypt to marry the pharaoh, while Mitanni succeeded in uniting a region that had previously been politically fragmented. Egypt was pursuing a different mission. It sought to reclaim a long-standing ideal, the reunification of Upper and Lower Egypt, a symbol that had defined the Egyptian state since its earliest days. As reflected in King Kamoses's words, the ruler of Thebes deeply resented having to share power with foreign rulers, an Asiatic in the north and a Nubian in the south. Over the course of 150 years, the kings of the 18th dynasty not only expelled these foreign powers, but also carried the conflict into their adversaries' own territories. Pharaohs led military campaigns both northward and southward. In Asia, they advanced as far as the Euphrates River, about 900 kilometers from Egypt's border, and in Nubia, they reached the Fifth Cataract, over 1,000 kilometers beyond the first. Strength of Egypt's army must have been formidable, but the frequency and persistence of their campaigns indicate that they faced strong and sustained resistance. Egypt confronted very different kinds of opponents in the north and south. In Nubia, the initial resistance came from a unified kingdom centered at Kerma near the Third Cataract. This state had flourished during Egypt's Second Intermediate Period, circa 1640 to 1539 BCE. Although it likely lacked strong central authority and left no trace of an organized bureaucracy. After the Kerma state collapsed, resistance to Egyptian expansion fell to smaller mobile groups who could retreat into the desert when necessary. Egypt eventually annexed Nubia, at least as far as the Third Cataract, placing the territory under the authority of a viceroy. Beyond that, between the Third and Fifth Cataracts, Egyptians built fortified settlements at key locations and worked through local leaders, integrating them into the Egyptian administrative system. Egypt's dominance in Nubia appears to have remained intact for roughly 500 years. In contrast, Egypt's approach to Syrio-Palestine was significantly different. Its control over this northern region was far more tenuous and inconsistent. Even though its initial campaigns there occurred around the same time as those in Nubia, the nature of the early resistance Egypt encountered in Syrio-Palestine is still unclear. Kamose referred to his northern enemies as Asiatics, a term modern scholars generally associate with the Hyksos, foreign rulers who had governed the Nile Delta and parts of northern Egypt for about a century. Several Hyksos kings ruled over small individual territories, though the dynasty based in Avaris had become the most prominent. Amos, the first ruler of the Theban-led 18th dynasty, launched attacks on Hyksos strongholds in the Delta, including the city of Avaris. He then pursued the retreating forces into southern Palestine, where he met and defeated further Hyksos resistance. By crossing Egypt's traditional boundary with Asia, Amos set a precedent that would be followed by his successors in the generations to come. For over 150 years, Egyptian military forces campaigned in Syrio-Palestine in an effort to assert dominance over the region. Initially, these expeditions were lengthy raids that encountered minimal resistance from the many small city-states. Eventually, however, under the rule of Thutmose, the first 1493 BCE and onward, Egyptian forces reached the Euphrates River, where they encountered the Mitanni, whose presence marked the limit of Egyptian advance. These campaigns established a form of diplomatic supremacy. Although the local rulers of Syrio-Palestine remained in place, they recognized Egypt as the leading power. This represented a new phase in Egypt's relationship with the region where earlier contact had been primarily commercial, especially with port cities like Byblos. Now it was political and imperial in nature. This new form of involvement may have posed an ideological challenge for Egypt, a state that had traditionally justified expansion through opposition to external enemies. Perhaps this is why, nearly a century after the Hyksos had been defeated, Queen Hatshepsut still referred to them as adversaries in her inscriptions, portraying her rule as a restoration of divine order after foreign disruption. Despite such rhetoric, Hatshepsut is not remembered primarily for her military campaigns. Instead, she is renowned and often admired for having assumed the throne as a woman during the minority of her nephew, Ramesses III. She ruled as a female pharaoh for 15 years and adopted all the formal symbols of kingship, including commissioning a grand mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. After her death in 1458 BCE, Thutmose III began ruling alone and dramatically changed Egypt's approach to Syrio-Palestine, launching a prolonged military campaign across 2 decades. He framed these campaigns as responses to uprisings by local city-state rulers. Initially, the king of Kadesh was identified as the main instigator, but later, the Mitanni monarch in the distant north became Egypt's primary rival. During his 8th campaign, Thutmose III reached the Euphrates. He led land-based operations and naval assaults using troop-carrying vessels to reach coastal cities in Syria. These campaigns secured Egypt's control over southern Syrio-Palestine. However, in the north, the strength of the Mitanni remained sufficient to keep many local rulers within their sphere of influence. The conflict between the two powers eventually subsided under Thutmose's successor, and it appears that both sides came to a tacit agreement regarding their respective areas of control. Thutmose II's military achievements are documented in his campaign annals, which detailed the tribute he collected from defeated cities. Interestingly, even rulers who were beyond his military reach sent him lavish gifts. Thutmose treated these offerings as if they were due to him, though in the diplomatic culture of the time, such exchanges were part of maintaining friendly relations. Among the foreign dignitaries who sent gifts were kings from 5 notable realms of Syria: Babylonia, Hatti, Asi, and Tanaya. These records, dated between 1456 and 1438 BCE, demonstrate that Egypt acknowledged a network of established neighboring states. Around this time, these regions also began producing their own written records, giving historians the opportunity to study their histories more directly. One such exchange came from Babylonia, which sent lapis lazuli, a highly prized blue gemstone, sourced from Afghanistan's, a diplomatic gift after Thutmose reached the Euphrates. While the Egyptian records don't name the Babylonian king, he was likely a member of the Kassite dynasty, which ruled the region at that time. The Kassites were a distinct people with their own language and customs. They had entered Babylonia early in the 2nd millennium BCE, and after the fall of Hammurabi's dynasty around 1600 BCE, they eventually took power, though the exact timing is uncertain. By around 1475 BCE, a single Kassite ruler governed Babylonia from the area of modern Baghdad to the Persian Gulf, and by 1400 BCE, their territory extended to the Dajala Valley and even Bahrain. Despite not waging major wars, at least none that have been documented, the Kassites emerged as a dominant regional force. The Egyptian kings addressed their Babylonian counterparts as equals in diplomatic correspondence. Under Kassite rule, Babylonia transformed from a patchwork of city-states into a unified territorial kingdom. Babylon became the uncontested capital, a significant shift from the earlier political landscape where multiple cities had held competing authority. Babylonia's most significant contribution to the Eastern Mediterranean world was cultural. Its influence extended far beyond its borders, as educated elites throughout the region embraced the Babylonian language, writing system, scribal practices, and literary works. Babylonian texts were read and studied in cities like Assur in Assyria, Hattusa in Anatolia, Imar in northern Syria, Megiddo in the southern Levant, and even Akhenaten in Egypt. For diplomatic exchanges, people from as far east as western Iran and as far west as Cyprus composed their messages on clay tablets in cuneiform, most often using the Babylonian language. Even the Kassite rulers of Babylonia had largely abandoned their own customs in favor of Babylonian traditions. Their native language appears only in personal names, and their gods held only minor official roles. The art from this period shows little sign of foreign or innovative influence, reflecting a full cultural assimilation in a list of foreign kings. Thutmose III mentions rulers of two lesser-known states, Asi and Tanaya. While their exact identities remain uncertain, many scholars believe Asi refers to Cyprus and Tanaya represents mainland Greece specifically, a version of the term Danawi, used in later times for the Greeks. Both regions are challenging to study due to the nature of the surviving written records. Although palatial administrations existed in these areas, their documents were mostly restricted to bureaucratic matters. In Greece, the Linear A and Linear B scripts were used for administrative record-keeping. The Cypriot script, known as Cyprominoan, remains undeciphered, but evidence suggests it too was focused on administration rather than narrative or historical texts. As a result, we have little hope of uncovering royal names or detailed accounts of political events. Instead, we must rely on archaeology and occasional references from foreign sources to understand what occurred in these lands. Even identifying the names outsiders used for the people we recognize through material culture is uncertain. Cyprus occupies a geographically central position in the eastern Mediterranean, situated within sight of the northern Syrian coast, just over 100 kilometers. Away in southeastern Anatolia, around 70 kilometers. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Cypriots were already importing ceramic vessels from Syrio-Palestine, indicating active trade links. It is almost certain that the peoples of the mainland regions were aware of the island. In reconstructing the history of Cyprus, we must rely entirely on archaeological findings. These findings suggest that the mid-2nd millennium was a time of disruption. Settlements were abandoned, and local material culture became regionally distinct rather than uniform across the island. This period of instability ended around 1400 BCE, when larger and more cohesive settlements appeared, along with a more standardized material culture. Scholars continue to debate whether the island was divided into regional centers or unified under a central authority, possibly based in the large settlement of Mek. Cyprus was rich in copper resources, making it a critical supplier of the metal for the wider eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian diplomatic records mention a kingdom called Alassia, whose ruler was described as having access to abundant copper supplies. Most scholars associate Alassia with Cyprus, although not everyone agrees. If the identification is correct, it places Cyprus within the broader network of international relations during the Late Bronze Age. The ruler of Alassia was acknowledged as a great king by the Egyptians' recognition that may not have depended on complete control over the island. The fact that the king of Alassia corresponded with other powers using Babylonian cuneiform suggests that he had an administration familiar with both the language and the script, indicating an advanced level of bureaucratic development. The history of Alassia must largely be reconstructed from scattered references and documents produced outside the island itself. These sources indicate that around 1350 BCE, the king of Alassia was considered among the great monarchs of the time. By the end of the 13th century, however, the Hittites had taken control of the island. Shortly after that, Egyptian records noted that Alassia had fallen to the Sea Peoples, an unpredictable force that emerged at the close of the Late Bronze Age and will be examined later. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a notable increase in Mycenaean artifacts, suggesting that groups from the Aegean region may have migrated to Cyprus. As a result, the island's history after 1200 took a distinctly different course from what had come before. The Mycenaeans held sway over the Aegean during the Late Bronze Age, dominating both the Greek mainland and the nearby islands extending toward the western coast of Anatolia. Their material culture is well understood through archaeology, but historical records about them remain scarce. A reference by Thutmose III to Tanaya hints at the existence of a political entity in the Aegean. Although the term itself is rare in Egyptian records, more commonly mentioned is a region called Keftia, most likely the island of Crete, from which tribute was sent to Egypt. These references imply that there were organized states in the Aegean that maintained contact with Egypt, though they provide little concrete historical detail to supplement this. We can look to Hittite sources, which offer valuable insight into Aegean affairs. They refer to a people called the Ahiawa, who lived along the western coast of Anatolia and the nearby islands. Although Ahiawa appears in records beginning in the 15th century BCE, the group became more prominent in the 13th century. During this period, the Hittite king Hattusili III referred to the Ahiawan ruler as his equal, addressing him as brother. A treaty signed by Tudela IV with the kingdom of Amaro in northern Syria originally listed Ahiawa among the major powers of the time alongside Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria, though the name was later removed from the final version. The reason for this erasure remains unclear, but the original inclusion signals that Ahiawa was recognized as a major player in regional politics. Tudela also launched a military campaign into Ahiawan territory and captured the city of Milawanda, likely the ancient city known later as Miletus. The identification of Ahiawa has long been debated, particularly regarding whether it corresponds to the Achaeans the name Homer used for the Greeks. This theory, proposed soon after the term Ahiawa was first discovered, remains controversial. While definitive proof is lacking, strong evidence suggests a Mycenaean political and military presence in western Anatolia. If this connection is valid, Homer's descriptions of Greek expansion into that area may reflect real historical events, and the archaeological remains of Bronze Age Greece could be directly linked to a group documented in written sources. Such a link would reinforce the idea that Ahiawa was one of the leading powers of the late Bronze Age. Thanks to the abundance of archaeological evidence, we are able to piece together aspects of Aegean history. The region was deeply integrated into the broader Eastern Mediterranean system of the time. Written records from the Greek mainland and Aegean islands do exist, but they are almost entirely administrative in nature. These texts help us understand the workings of Mycenaean bureaucracy, though they reveal little about historical events or political developments. The documents come from palace archives inscribed on clay tablets in a writing system known as linear B. This script combines syllabic and ideographic signs and was used to record an early form of the Greek language. Tablets have been unearthed on Kretat Knossos in Kenya and on the mainland, especially at Pylos, with smaller finds at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes. However, these records are undated, do not mention kings by name, and contain no narratives of campaigns or royal achievements, making it impossible to construct a political history from them alone. The Aegean region has been extensively explored through archaeology, allowing scholars to trace political and cultural patterns to a considerable degree. Between approximately 1600 and 1450 BCE, two distinct archaeological cultures existed side by side, one centered on the island of Crete, the other on the Greek mainland. These are known as the late Minoan and late Helladic cultures, respectively. Late Minoan culture in Crete featured a network of large elite residences known as villas, which resembled palaces in layout and function. Among these, the palace at Naissus stood out as the most prominent and sophisticated, and it may have served as the central hub of a unified administrative system that spanned most or all of Crete. Cretan influence during this period extended throughout the Aegean islands. Although direct evidence is scarce, it is possible that Crete exercised maritime dominance, a notion supported by later Greek writers like Herodotus and Thucydides. Meanwhile, on the Greek mainland, the late Helladic period saw the emergence of a shared Mycenaean culture across southern and central regions, including the Peloponnese, Attica, and parts of eastern Thessaly. This culture is best illustrated by findings at Mycenae, although there is no definitive proof that Mycenae functioned as the political or cultural center of the entire region. The Mycenaean elite were clearly powerful and wealthy, as shown by their richly furnished tombs and other archaeological evidence. Around 1450 BCE, the distinction between Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece faded. Mycenaean cultural elements began to dominate. following the destruction of nearly all Minoan palace centers, on Crete, Knossos being the sole exception. The cause of this sudden transformation remains unclear. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans may have conquered the island by force, while others suggest that the transition could have been the result of internal unrest, with the Cretans subsequently adopting Mycenaean customs. The 14th and 13th centuries BCE marked the peak of Mycenaean civilization, posing fortified palaces, especially at Mycenae and Thebes, reflect the power and affluence of a militarized elite. The elaborate tholos tombs at Mycenae, romantically named the tombs of Atreus and Clytemnestra by 19th century excavator Heinrich Schliemann, highlight the concentration of wealth in the hands of this ruling class. During this period, a remarkable cultural consistency spread across the Aegean, and Mycenaean influence extended far beyond Greece. Their presence reached into Cyprus and the Anatolian coast. Trade played a significant role in their expansion. Mycenaean artifacts have been discovered across Cyprus, Western Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. These findings indicate that the Mycenaeans were deeply integrated into the commercial networks that connected the broader Eastern Mediterranean. They also established contact with communities further west, shown by the presence of Mycenaean ceramics in Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, and Malta. Politically, the Mycenaean world likely resembled the organization found in the Syro-Palestinian region. Elites based in palace centers controlled the surrounding villages. The economy was managed through centralized planning. Figures referred to as wainaks in the Linear B tablet skings, or king-like leaders, presided over these palatial centers. A distinct martial tone characterizes the remains from mainland Greece. The massive Cyclopean walls at Mycenae are clear indicators of a society shaped by military values. However, it is unclear whether a single monarch ruled over a confederation of palaces. The question of political unity within the Mycenaean world remains unresolved. Homeric tradition portrays Mycenae as a leading power, implying a degree of cohesion, but historians debate the accuracy of that view. Most modern scholars lean toward the idea that the region was composed of multiple independent or semi-independent polis. Nevertheless, there is evidence of communication and cooperation between palaces. Linear B texts reveal contact among elites from different Mycenaean cities, and personal names of noble figures appear on tablets discovered at more than one site. This could suggest the existence of a shared aristocracy, or even a unifying dynasty. Furthermore, the uniformity of material culture, particularly in administrative records across the Mycenaean world, points to an overarching structure that imposed common practices, possibly akin to what we find in the Mitanni and Hittite political systems, situated at the western edge of the eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean civilization appears to have been as formidable as other major states documented in contemporary records. Warriors from mainland Greece, operating from heavily fortified strongholds, expanded their reach across the mainland, Aegean islands, and even Crete. They also established a presence along the Anatolian coast, engaging diplomatically and militarily with groups such as the Hittites. Yet the Mycenaeans were not the region's only dominant force. On the island of Cyprus, another ruler held sway, one who was also recognized as a great king within the diplomatic sphere of Akhenaten's Egypt.